A geneticist in Lafayette pulls up two columns of data on a screen. On the left, a sample set drawn from Cajun families along Bayou Teche, people whose grandparents spoke French at the supper table and nowhere else. On the right, a reference population from modern France, pulled from public genomic databases used by labs across the world. The expectation, going in, is simple. These people descend from French settlers. The numbers should look like cousins. Instead, the allele frequencies drift apart in ways that a first-year genetics student would flag as strange, clusters that do not sit where a straightforward French lineage would predict, markers that show up at rates barely present in France at all. The lab did not publish this as a mystery. They published it as a footnote in a larger population study. But footnotes like this one are exactly what unravel 300 years of family assumption, and this is the story of why a Cajun family's DNA test can come back looking less French than the family itself ever suspected, and why that is not a contradiction. It is a record of everything that happened between Poitou and the Atchafalaya Basin. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Start with where the founders actually came from, because the word France covers a country that did not exist yet in any modern administrative sense when the first Acadian settlers left it. The families who crossed to Acadie in the 1630s and 40s came overwhelmingly from a narrow strip of west-central France, the Poitou region and its neighbors Aunis and Saintonge, the marshy salt country around Loudun and La Rochelle, where families worked the tidal flats for a living long before anyone in the household had heard of Nova Scotia. Genealogists working from parish registers and notarial records have traced the great majority of founding Acadian surnames back to this one corridor, in some cases down to the individual village. Not the whole of France, not a national cross-section. A few thousand people from a handful of parishes, farmers and salt marsh laborers who signed onto ships bound for a colony most of them would never leave and whose descendants would not set foot in France again for centuries. They called themselves Acadians. 200 years and a different continent later, the word had worn down in local speech to Acadian, and then in English spelling to Cajun, the same identity carried across an ocean, and a language shift in one syllable. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because a population founded by a few hundred families from one region of France is not, genetically, a miniature France. It is a sample, and a small one, and small samples carry whatever quirks happen to be present in the people who got on the boat. A rare variant common in one Poitevin village might be nearly absent 40 miles away. If that village happens to be overrepresented among the founders, the variant rides along into the new colony at a frequency nothing like the national average, and it stays there, because for the next century almost nobody marries in from outside the group. This is called founder effect, and it is not speculation. It is one of the best documented mechanisms in population genetics, and Acadian settlement is one of the clearest field examples geneticists point to when they teach it, alongside populations like the Amish of Pennsylvania or the Ashkenazi Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, groups small enough at their founding and closed enough afterward that a handful of ancestors can still be read in the genome of their descendants centuries later. Then came the part of the story most people already know the outline of, even if they have never heard the French name for it. The Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. In the 1750s, with Britain and France at war for control of North America, British colonial authorities in Nova Scotia decided the Acadian population, French-speaking, Catholic, and unwilling to swear unconditional loyalty to the crown, could not be trusted to remain on land Britain now controlled. Starting in 1755, soldiers moved through Acadian villages, burned homes and crops behind them, and loaded families onto ships without regard for keeping husbands with wives or parents with children. Somewhere between 11,000 and 18,000 people were forced out over the following years. Ships sank. Disease moved through crowded holds the way it always does. Survivors scattered wherever a captain happened to have orders to unload them, English colonies from Georgia up through Massachusetts, the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, the Falkland Islands for one unfortunate group that never took root there at all, and back across the Atlantic to France itself, a country many of them had never seen, since their own families had been born in Acadie for 4 or 5 generations by then. The colonies that absorbed the first wave of exiles rarely wanted them for long. Virginia refused to let ships full of Acadian deportees even land, and sent them on to England instead, where several hundred spent years in prison hulks and internment camps near Liverpool and Bristol before being released at the war's end, with nowhere in particular to go. Georgia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania took in smaller groups who found themselves treated as a burden by colonial governments already juggling their own poor, quartered in barns and outbuildings, sometimes bound out as indentured labor to pay for their own upkeep. A number of families made their way north instead of south, crossing into French Quebec, where the language was familiar even if the welcome was thin, since Quebec's own settlers had little surplus to share with thousands of newly landless cousins. The Acadian diaspora that resulted touched nearly every English colony on the Atlantic seaboard at some point in the 1750s and 60s, which is part of why genealogists tracing Acadian lines sometimes find a family surfacing briefly in a Massachusetts parish register or a Maryland tax roll before it disappears again, one stop on a path that would not end until Louisiana. France did not know what to do with them. Acadian refugees who landed in French ports found a country that treated them as foreign, unable to fully absorb thousands of exiles who spoke an archaic dialect of French and knew nothing of French agricultural methods or French bureaucracy. Some were resettled in barren stretches of Brittany and Poitou that nobody else wanted, land so poor the French crown had struggled to give it away to its own citizens. Some drifted toward the colonies again the moment passage became available, unwilling to stay in a homeland that had never felt like one. And in 1785, a Spanish organized expedition gathered roughly 1,600 of these displaced Acadians from the port of Nantes and sent them across the Atlantic on 7 ships, bound for a colony Spain now controlled and wanted populated with loyal Catholic settlers. That colony was Louisiana. The 7 ships of 1785 are one of the best documented single migrations in Acadian genealogy, passenger by passenger, family by family, recorded in Spanish colonial ledgers that still survive, and a significant share of Cajun surnames alive in Louisiana today trace directly to that one voyage. They were not the first Acadians to arrive. Small groups had been trickling into Spanish Louisiana since the late 1760s, drawn by land grants and by word that the colony's government would let them keep speaking French and practicing their religion in peace, unlike the English colonies where so many exiles had spent the previous decade as unwelcome charity cases. One of the earliest and most consequential of these arrivals was a man named Joseph Broussard, known to his own people by the nickname Beausoleil, who had led armed Acadian resistance against the British occupation of Nova Scotia for years after the expulsion began, refusing to accept exile quietly, and conducting guerrilla raids from the woods around the Bay of Fundy until the fight became impossible to sustain. In 1765, he brought a group of Acadian refugees from exile in Saint-Domingue to the Attakapas district of Spanish Louisiana, the prairie and marsh country west of what is now Lafayette, and helped establish the first organized Acadian settlement on the Bayou Teche. He died of fever within months of arriving, one of the earliest names on a very long list of Acadian settlers who did not live to see what their landing became, though his surname alone now accounts for one of the most common family names in South Louisiana. What it became was a population that kept marrying itself. For the first several generations in Louisiana, Acadian settlers overwhelmingly married other Acadian settlers, the same demographic pattern of an isolated founding group that had shaped them back in Nova Scotia, now repeating itself in a new place among the bayous, prairies, and swamp margins of the Attakapas and Lafourche districts. Parish marriage records from the late 1700s and into the 1800s show the same handful of surnames marrying into each other generation after generation. Broussard, Thibodeau, Landry, Melançon, Hébert, Boudreau, Arsenault, Gautier, Leblanc, Guidry. Modern parishes carrying names like Lafayette, St. Martin, Iberia, St. Landry, and Terrebonne still hold heavy concentrations of the same surnames, in some cases the same families sitting on land their ancestors received under Spanish land grants 2.5 centuries ago. If a founder effect had already narrowed the genetic pool once in Nova Scotia, crossing the Atlantic twice, and settling in a swamp among your own cousins narrowed it again, the settlement itself split along lines that still shape South Louisiana today. Families who took up land on the wet, low-lying bayous around Bayou Teche and Bayou Lafourche built an economy around fishing, trapping, and small-scale farming on the natural levees, close quarters, close kin, and relatively little contact with outsiders for generations. Families who moved instead onto the open prairie country further west, around what became the towns of Opelousas, Aunis, and Church Point, built a different economy around cattle and rice, land that put them in more regular contact with the free people of color, Creole planters, and indigenous communities who also worked that same prairie ground. Genealogists and historians who study the two branches separately have long noted that Prairie Cajun families show, on average, a somewhat wider genetic footprint than Bayou Cajun families of comparable age, a difference traceable directly to which patch of Louisiana geography their ancestors happened to settle and who else was living on it. But isolation was never total, and this is where the DNA comparison gets more complicated than a simple story of French people staying French for 3 centuries. Louisiana under Spanish rule brought Spanish colonial administrators and soldiers into contact with Acadian settlements, and some of those Spanish families intermarried with Acadian ones. Louisiana's governor Bernardo de Galvez recruited settlers directly from Spain's Canary Islands between 1778 and 1783. Several thousand Isleño families placed south and east of New Orleans, close enough to Acadian territory that intermarriage between the two Catholic, Spanish-administered communities occurred within a generation. Further north along the Mississippi, a wave of German-speaking immigrants had settled what became known as the German Coast decades earlier, recruited under John Law's Mississippi Company in the 1720s. And by the time large Acadian settlement began, German surnames were already anglicizing and, in a fair number of documented cases, marrying into French Catholic Louisiana families, sometimes changing their own names into French spellings in the process, a Weber becoming a Webry, a Zeringer becoming something closer to Zeringue. The prairies and bayous the Acadians settled were not empty. They were the territory of the Attakapas people and the Chitimacha, whose own villages predated the arrival of any European by centuries, and documented intermarriage between Acadian settlers and indigenous Louisianans occurred from the earliest generations, though church and civil records from the period frequently obscured or misrecorded indigenous ancestry rather than naming it plainly, folding it silently into categories like white or free person of color, depending on which classification suited the moment. And Louisiana's plantation economy brought enslaved and later free people of African descent into direct contact, and in some documented cases into family lines, with the Acadian population that would come to call itself Cajun. A demographic reality South Louisiana genealogists and historians have spent the last several decades working to document more openly than the original records ever allowed. Colonial Louisiana operated a racial classification system considerably more layered than the simple white and black divide common elsewhere in the American South, recognizing a distinct free population of color, the gens de couleur libres, with its own churches, property holdings, and in some documented cases direct kinship ties to Acadian families living nearby. Later generations of Americanization pressed hard to flatten that complexity into a binary that suited 19th and 20th century Louisiana law, and a fair number of family trees that once acknowledged mixed ancestry openly in colonial-era records had that acknowledgement quietly dropped from later census entries and family retellings, one more thread that DNA testing today sometimes turns back up without any accompanying paperwork ready to explain it. So by the time you run a Cajun family's DNA against a reference population from modern France, you are not comparing two versions of the same thing. You are comparing a population that carries a 17th century founder signature from one narrow region of France, concentrated and locked in place by generations of intermarriage within the group, layered with 2.5 centuries of Spanish, German, Indigenous, and African admixture that France's own population, shaped by an entirely different set of migrations, never experienced in the same way or the same proportions. Modern France, meanwhile, is not a genetic time capsule either. Centuries of internal migration, urbanization pulling rural populations into cities, and substantial 20th century immigration from elsewhere in Europe and North Africa have all reshaped what a national French genetic reference sample actually looks like today. Comparing a Louisiana bayou parish to a modern French national database is, in a real sense, comparing two populations that both drifted away from the same starting point, just in completely different directions and for completely different reasons. The clearest, most clinically documented signature of this isolation shows up not in ancestry percentages but in disease. Usher syndrome type 1C, a rare genetic condition causing combined deafness and progressive vision loss, occurs among Acadian and Cajun populations of Louisiana at a rate documented in medical genetics literature to be dramatically higher than in the general population, traced by researchers to a single founder mutation carried by one or a small handful of the original Acadian settlers and then passed down through generations of a genetically concentrated population. A related condition, a hereditary form of Fanconi-Renotubular syndrome, has likewise been documented specifically among descendants of Acadian settlers in both Nova Scotia and Louisiana, again traced to a founder mutation in this same historically isolated population. Genetic counseling programs affiliated with Louisiana medical centers have built targeted carrier screening panels around exactly these conditions because the odds of encountering them in a patient of confirmed Cajun descent are high enough to plan for in a way that would make no sense in a general population screen. These are not folk stories, they are published findings in medical genetics journals, the kind of evidence that shows up when researchers go looking for why a rare condition clusters so heavily in one regional population and nowhere else nearby. When a population carries measurable, clinically significant founder mutations that trace to a specific handful of ancestors from a specific corner of 17th century France, that population's genome is going to look distinct from a national French sample in ways that have nothing to do with how French their ancestry actually is, and everything to do with how thoroughly that ancestry got concentrated and then left alone. Consumer DNA testing companies have run into this pattern often enough that several now build a distinct genetic community category specifically for Acadian and Cajun descent, separate from their general France or general Western Europe categories, precisely because the founder signature is strong and consistent enough across thousands of customer samples to be flagged as its own recognizable cluster. A person can match into this Acadian settler community with confidence even when their overall percentage of French ancestry looks modest on the summary page, because the algorithm is not measuring how French someone is in the abstract. It is measuring whether their genome carries the specific concentrated signature of that one small founding population from Poitou, and by the time that signature reaches a customer's report today, it has already passed through Nova Scotia, Exile, Spanish Louisiana, and 2 centuries of intermarriage on top of whatever fraction of it started out as simple French ancestry in the first place. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. None of this stayed easy to talk about, and this is the part of the story that has less to do with genetics and more to do with what happened to the people carrying it. Cajun French, the dialect descended from that original Poitevin speech, and reshaped over centuries in Louisiana, was for generations the first language of most families in the bayou parishes, spoken at home, in church, at the market, long after English had become the language of Louisiana's cities and its state government. That began to change with force in 1921, when a new Louisiana state constitution mandated English as the sole language of public school instruction. What followed in rural Cajun parishes has been documented repeatedly in oral histories collected across the 20th century. Children arriving at school speaking only French and being punished for it, made to write lines, some remembering a version of the sentence, "I will not speak French on the school grounds," copied out by hand 100 times, made to stand in corners, in some accounts physically struck, simply for speaking the only language they had ever known at home. Teachers told students, sometimes explicitly, that French was the language of poor people and of shame, that getting ahead in Louisiana meant leaving it behind entirely. Families absorbed that lesson quickly, and the ones raising children through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s made a decision that repeats across an enormous number of Cajun family histories. They stopped teaching French to their kids, not because they forgot it, because they had learned, through their own children coming home humiliated, that passing it down was passing down a liability. A grandmother who had spoken nothing but French until she was 6 years old might raise her own children to understand not one word of it, a single generation cutting a linguistic line that had run unbroken since Poitou. Along with the language went a broader retreat from openly claiming a distinct identity at all. The word Cajun itself carried an edge of insult for much of the 20th century, used the way a slur is used, alongside a cruder term that circulated through the same period and is still recognized as an ethnic slur by the people it was aimed at, and plenty of families who could have claimed the label loudly chose instead to blend into a generalized white Louisiana identity where nobody asked which parish your grandfather's French came from. French-language newspapers that had once served these communities folded one after another through the middle of the century. Radio stations that had broadcast in French switched to English or dropped their French programming to a token hour on Sunday mornings. By the 1960s, demographers working in Louisiana were describing Cajun French as a dying language, spoken fluently mostly by people over 60 and almost nowhere passed down intact to their grandchildren. Television reached the Bayou parishes by the 1950s, broadcasting almost entirely in English, and returning servicemen after 2 world wars came home from an experience that had, for many, been the first extended period of their lives spent surrounded by English speakers who mocked or simply failed to understand a French accent from rural Louisiana. Both forces pushed in the same direction as the schools had, making English not just the language of getting ahead, but increasingly the only language a person heard outside the home at all, until for a growing number of households it became the only language spoken inside the home as well. What survived, survived in fragments, the way these things usually do. A grandmother who would slip into French only when angry, without ever explaining why. A family recipe passed down with its Acadian name intact, while everything else about the culture around it got quietly Americanized. A surname that everyone in South Louisiana could place within one bayou parish or another, even after 3 generations of English-only schooling had stripped away the language that surname originally belonged to. The DNA sat in all of them the entire time, indifferent to what got spoken at the dinner table, carrying the Poitou founder signature and the Spanish and German and Indigenous and African threads woven into it over 2.5 centuries, waiting in a form no schoolteacher's ruler could touch. The turnback started later than most people expect, and it started as a deliberate act of policy rather than a spontaneous cultural swell. In 1968, Louisiana State Representative James Domingo pushed through legislation creating the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, an agency built specifically to reverse what 50 years of English-only schooling had done, bringing French-speaking teachers from France, Quebec, and Belgium into Louisiana classrooms and treating the near loss of Cajun French as a cultural emergency worth state resources to fix. The timing was not accidental. 4 years earlier, in 1964, a Cajun fiddler named Dewey Balfa had traveled to the Newport Folk Festival in Rhode Island and watched an audience of outsiders respond with genuine excitement to music his own state had spent decades treating as an embarrassment, and he came home determined to convince Louisiana that what it had almost thrown away was worth keeping. It came for many families 1 generation too late to save fluency. Elders who could still speak the old dialect fluently were by then often the last in their line who could, but it came early enough to make speaking French, and by extension claiming Cajun identity out loud, something a person in South Louisiana could do again without flinching. Festivals built around Cajun music and food began drawing crowds by the tens of thousands within a decade. French immersion schools opened in several bayou parishes starting in the 1980s, teaching a new generation the language their own grandparents had been beaten out of speaking. Vermilionville, a living history museum built along Bayou Vermilion outside Lafayette, opened its gates, reconstructing an 18th and 19th century Cajun and Creole settlement, down to the architecture and the crops in the garden, giving visitors and schoolchildren alike a physical place to stand inside a history that for decades had existed mostly as something older relatives declined to discuss. And it came almost exactly alongside the earliest wave of consumer and academic genetic testing, which is why so many Cajun families' first real look at their own DNA landed in the middle of a cultural revival rather than in the silence that had defined the previous 2 generations. A family that had spent 50 years not talking about being Cajun found itself, sometimes within the same decade, both watching French return to local school curricula and opening an envelope with a DNA report inside that did not match the tidy story of straightforward French ancestry 100 years of quiet Americanization had left them expecting. Genetic markers concentrated in the Poitou region and virtually nowhere else in France, elevated frequencies and ranges the reference population barely touched. Traces the report could not fully explain because the report was comparing them to modern France, not to the specific corner of it their ancestors actually left, and not to everything Louisiana had added along the way in the 2.5 centuries since. What the discrepancy actually documents, once you trace it all the way back, is not an error in anyone's family story, it is the genetic record of every stage that story passed through. A founding population drawn from one narrow strip of 17th century France, concentrated further by 2.5 centuries of intermarriage within a group that had every reason to stay close to itself, layered with Spanish, German, Indigenous, and African ancestry that arrived at specific documented points along the way, then nearly severed from its own language and public identity for 2 generations, before a deliberate, government-funded effort brought it back into the open. A modern reference population from France carries none of that particular sequence, because France itself took a different 2.5 centuries to become what it is today. The two populations were never going to line up cleanly, and the fact that they do not is not a flaw in the science. It is the science working exactly as it should, showing a family precisely what happened to their ancestors, instead of the simplified version that got handed down at the supper table. The bayou parishes of South Louisiana today are full of surnames that have not moved more than a few miles in 250 years. Families who can trace an unbroken line from a specific ship in 1785 to a specific stretch of Bayou Teche or Bayou Lafourche, where their descendants still live. Cajun French is spoken again, taught again, sung again, in the music that carries the culture's name into rooms far outside Louisiana, at festivals in Lafayette that now draw visitors from countries the original settlers never heard of. And somewhere in a lab, that same population's genome keeps returning results that a simple France comparison cannot fully explain, not because the ancestry is uncertain, but because it is more specific, more concentrated, and more layered than a single national label was ever built to describe. What the DNA shows is not a mismatch with France. It is a match with a version of France that stopped existing the moment those first families boarded a ship out of La Rochelle, and a Louisiana that quietly added everything else on top of what they carried, one generation, one marriage, one hidden language, and one recovered festival at a time. Somewhere back along that line sits a specific parish in Poitou that most of these families will never visit and most could not name without help from a genealogist, a handful of ancestors who boarded a ship without any way of knowing that the marshland dialect they carried and the closed intermarrying community they belonged to would still be legible in their descendants' genetic code 3.5 centuries and one ocean crossing later. The test that comes back looking strange against a modern French sample is not lying to the family that opens it. It is telling them the truth in more detail than the simplified version ever offered, and it is a truth that took a war, an ocean, a swamp, and 2 generations of enforced silence to write. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.